May 21, 1620. The Mayflower arrives in Cape Cod Bay, and we have ourselves a situation. The Pilgrims are desperate for food, and the nearest people who could help them are thousands of miles away. That's right, we're about to meet some natives. Welcome to the first episode of a series about the Pilgrims. Chapter 4, Meeting the Wampanoag. So, if you've been paying attention, you may be wondering why the Pilgrims didn't just head south to meet up with the Spanish or French settlers. And that is because there weren't any. The closest Europeans were more than 3,000 miles away in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada. See, this part of the world had actually been uninhabited by Europeans for several hundred years. You see, when Henry Hudson sailed into New England in 1609, he was looking for a sea route to the Pacific Ocean, but found nothing but rocks and ice. So when the English decided they wanted to establish a colony, they chose a spot in present-day Maine. They called it Popham, and it was abandoned after just 1 year due to harsh conditions and a mosquito-borne disease called malaria. After that, no English people returned to New England for another 10 years. During that time, a few French fishermen did show up, but they didn't stay long either. So when the Mayflower arrived carrying 51 English settlers, they were the first people of European descent to set foot in New England in over a decade. Now, the land they landed on was inhabited by a Native American tribe known as the Wampanoag, a term which actually encompassed many different Algonquian-speaking tribes. The Wampanoag people had lived in New England for thousands of years. During the first week of November, the Wampanoag men were out hunting when they spotted something strange on the beach. At first, they thought it was a boat, but as they got closer, they realized that it was a large wooden structure on wheels. The men hid in the trees and watched as strange men emerged from the ship and began to explore the shore. One brave soul even approached the ship, and when the men inside saw him, they yelled and made threatening gestures. The native man ran back to his friends, and together they decided to leave the newcomers alone for the time being. These first encounters between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims are often portrayed as peaceful and friendly. But as you can imagine, both sides were very cautious during these first meetings. Neither group knew anything about the other, and so each tried to learn as much as possible while avoiding any conflict. The English had brought with them an interpreter named John Alleyne, who had some experience with the natives further south. He would later become famous for translating the Bible into the language of the Narragansett tribe, and it was through him that the Wampanoag learned the English word for peace, which they adopted as part of their own language, calling it Panodimig, or man who has come in peace. But although the Pilgrims had an interpreter, the Wampanoag did not. The language barrier made communication difficult, and so it took months for a real understanding to develop between the two groups. Much of the early interaction was done through sign language, and it wasn't until the following spring that the first Wampanoag English dictionary was created. The Wampanoag men who first encountered the Pilgrims were Massasoit's scouts, and within a month, the two groups met face to face. Now Massasoit was the sachem, or leader, of the Wampanoag, and he was interested in learning all that he could about the newcomers. It's important to remember that, to the Wampanoag, the Pilgrims weren't even people. They didn't know what to make of these strange, pale-skinned men with their funny clothes and even funnier ways. In fact, the word the Wampanoag used to describe the Pilgrims literally meant people who came in a strange boat. But despite the fact that neither group fully understood what was going on, Massasoit was willing to take a chance on these new arrivals. He figured he had nothing to lose by befriending them, but everything to gain. He needed all the allies he could get to protect his people from the growing threat of the Dutch and English colonists to the north. And so he invited the Pilgrims to attend a great feast, and they accepted. This meeting is often called the First Thanksgiving, and it's said that 90 Wampanoag attended, including 80 warriors. This must have been quite a sight to behold, as the English were still wearing their travel clothes, and the natives were painted and feathered for war. But despite their differences, they managed to communicate well enough to form an alliance. The Wampanoag taught the Pilgrims how to cultivate the land and provided them with food and other necessities. In exchange, the Pilgrims taught the Wampanoag how to use firearms, which were a great improvement over the bows and arrows the natives had been using up until this point. But despite this uneasy alliance, the Wampanoag were suspicious of the English. They knew that the Spanish and French explorers had nearly always been hostile towards the natives, and they had good reason to think that the Pilgrims were the same. In fact, just a few weeks after the treaty was signed, a group of armed English soldiers showed up at a native village demanding that the Wampanoag hand over their guns. The natives refused, and so the English took it upon themselves to confiscate the weapons by force. This incident almost led to war, but Massasoit managed to calm things down by pointing out that the treaty specifically stated that the Wampanoag were allowed to keep their possessions. Realizing that they had made a mistake, the English apologized and gave the natives compensation for their guns. Tensions were high after this, and it seemed as though war might break out at any moment. But both sides wanted to avoid that, and so they held off. The next year, though, things would come to a head. As the English colonists grew bolder, they began to encroach on Wampanoag territory. In 1622, they even arrested 2 natives for trespassing. When Massasoit heard about this, he was furious, and he immediately assembled his warriors. But before he could do anything, he fell ill and died. His son, Metacomet, known to the English as King Philip, took over as sachem, and he continued his father's policy of trying to coexist with the English. But not all of the Wampanoag were happy with this arrangement. Many wanted revenge against the English for taking their land and oppressing their people. And when Metacomet took his father's life in 1627, those people were ready to fight. Over the next few years, the Wampanoag would wage war against the English, and it would be brutal. But that is a story for another time. To learn more about the Wampanoag people, check out the additional resources, and to learn what happened next, stay tuned for Chapter 5. See you soon.